What happens when a young, arrogant cop challenges a 72-year-old war vet in his own neighborhood? What if the vet's son is not just any man, but a former SEAL team commander? Watch as one man stands up for respect and justice. Will the rookie cop learn the hard way? Find out in this intense showdown. Watch now on H2 Black Thread. Don't forget to like and subscribe. The sun hung low in the sky over New Orleans, casting a sweltering heat over the city. The streets were alive with the hum of summer, people going about their business, the distant sound of barbecues sizzling, and the rhythm of life that defined Pop's neighborhood. At 72 years old, Jamal Pops Carter had been a part of this community for more than 4 decades. He knew the streets, the people, and the little details that made this place feel like home. For him, it was just another warm summer afternoon. Pops, a war veteran, had seen it all. His body carried the weight of time and the scars of his past, but his mind remained sharp. His cane tapped steadily against the cracked sidewalk as he made his way home, carrying a brown paper bag filled with groceries from the local store. His movements were slow but deliberate, a man at peace with the rhythm of life he had come to know. The air was thick with the scent of fresh-cut grass, mingled with the unmistakable aroma of grilled food from a nearby backyard. Pops inhaled deeply, the smell reminding him of days long past when he would sit with his wife and children on the porch, enjoying the simple pleasures of life. But those days were gone, and now Pops walked alone, a fixture in the neighborhood, his quiet presence respected by those who knew him. As Pops reached the corner of Jefferson Highway, he heard the crunch of tires on asphalt. He glanced over his shoulder and saw a police cruiser slowing down as it passed. The officer inside, a young man with a buzz cut and mirrored sunglasses, locked eyes with Pops, and for a moment, the tension between them was palpable. Pops had been through this before, too many times to count. He had seen young officers like this one, eager to prove something, sizing him up without knowing a damn thing about who he was. Pops didn't break his stride, but he could feel the officer's eyes on him. The car didn't pass. Instead, it slowed to a crawl, following behind him. Pop's heart didn't race, but something deep inside him knew this wasn't just a coincidence. He had lived through the wars, the battles, both abroad and here at home, and he could tell when things were about to get ugly. Then came the unmistakable sound of the siren, cutting through the quiet afternoon like a knife. It was sharp, unnecessary, and as soon as it blared, Pops knew exactly what was coming. "Hey, stop right there!" The officer's voice called out from the cruiser. Pops stopped, his grip tightening around the brown paper bag, the familiar weight of his cane grounding him. He had done nothing wrong, but the feeling in his gut told him that wasn't going to matter today. He stood still for a moment, taking a deep breath before turning to face the officer. The door of the cruiser swung open, and out stepped Officer Michael Stevens. He was young, probably just out of the academy, and he wore his arrogance like a badge. The way he adjusted his belt and squared his shoulders, it was clear he had something to prove. Pops had seen this before. Too many young officers who thought they could walk all over someone like him because of the color of his skin. "What are you doing in this neighborhood?" Stevens asked, his voice sharp and demanding. Pops raised an eyebrow and gave him a steady look. "I live here," he said, his voice calm but firm. It was the truth, after all. Stevens looked him up and down with a skeptical glance, eyeing the faded jeans, the worn-out cap perched on Pop's head, and the heavy boots that had seen more battles than Stevens likely ever would. "You got ID on you?" he asked, clearly not convinced by the old man's word. Pops let out a short sigh. He had been through this before, and it always went the same way. The young officers were always quick to doubt, quick to assume that a man like him was up to something just because of the way he looked. Pops had lived through a time when his very presence was seen as a threat. "I left my wallet at home," Pop said, his tone measured but calm. "I can give you my address. You can check the system." Stevens wasn't buying it. He stepped closer, narrowing his eyes. "Convenient," he muttered, his voice dripping with suspicion. Pops felt his frustration rising. "You can ask anyone around here. I've lived here since before you were born," he said, motioning toward the block ahead where his neighbors lived. Stevens didn't move. Instead, he reached for his radio, speaking into the mic with authority. "Dispatch, I've got a suspicious individual on South Foster. Older black male, possibly loitering. Claims he lives in the area. Gonna need backup." Pop's stomach tightened, but his face remained calm. He had been through far worse than this. He had fought wars, survived Jim Crow, and now here he was, 72 years old, still having to explain himself to a kid who didn't know the first thing about respect. The seconds felt like hours as Stevens waited for a response. Pops could feel the weight of the situation, the power shift that was happening before his eyes. The officer wasn't interested in listening or understanding. He was interested in control, and that's what Pops was up against now. A few minutes later, another squad car arrived, 2 more officers stepping out. They were older than Stevens, but the look in their eyes was the same, a mix of annoyance and the kind of indifference that came from being part of a system that didn't care about people like Pops. One of the officers glanced at Stevens, then back at Pops. "You live around here?" the second officer asked. "I already told him I do," Pops replied, his patience wearing thin. The officer sighed, shifting his weight. "Let's see some ID then, and we can all go about our day." Pop's heart sank. He didn't have his wallet. It was sitting on his kitchen counter, just a few minutes away, where he had left it to check some old VA paperwork. His mind raced for a moment, but he didn't panic. He knew this game all too well. "I don't have it on me," he said slowly, "but you can check the system. I live right here." Stevens' eyes narrowed. "Convenient," he said again, his tone laced with suspicion. Pops felt the tension rise in his chest, but he refused to back down. "You can call my neighbors. They'll tell you who I am." Then it happened. The officer's hand rested on his belt, not yet on his gun, but close enough to send a message. The words were clear without being spoken. This wasn't just about paperwork. This was about control. The next few minutes passed in silence, the weight of the moment hanging heavy between them. Pops could feel the stares of the officers on him, the way they waited for him to make a move, to give them a reason to escalate things. But he wouldn't. He wasn't going to make this worse than it needed to be. But as the minutes stretched on, Pops realized this wasn't just a simple misunderstanding. It was the same fight he had fought his entire life. Only now, it wasn't a fight against enemies abroad or racism in the streets. It was a fight for his right to be left alone, to walk down his own street in peace. And yet, it was clear the officers weren't going to let it go so easily. The heat was suffocating, thick in the air, as Pop stood on the sidewalk watching the young officer before him. The tension between them was palpable, the kind of weight that only comes when one person has authority and the other is trying to keep their dignity intact. Pops had seen this before, many times throughout his life, but that didn't make it any easier to endure. "Let me see your ID," Officer Stevens demanded again, his voice sharp and commanding. The officer stood with his arms crossed, eyes sizing Pops up, looking for a reason to escalate things. Pops could feel the frustration beginning to rise within him, but he stayed calm like he always did. He had been here before, long before Stevens had even been born. "I don't have it on me," Pops replied, keeping his voice steady. "It's at home. I can give you my address. You can check it through the system." Stevens didn't seem convinced. His eyes darted over Pop's old jeans, his faded war cap, and his worn boots, none of which screamed respectable citizen in the officer's mind. Pops knew the look. He had seen it too many times before. The officer didn't trust him simply because of the way he looked. It wasn't about the address or the fact that he had lived in this neighborhood longer than Stevens had even been alive. It was about assumptions, about judgment, and Pops had learned long ago that no amount of reasoning would change that. "I need to see your ID," Stevens repeated, this time with more force in his voice. "Now." Pops took a deep breath, feeling the heat of the situation starting to suffocate him. This wasn't about paperwork. This wasn't about some simple check. This was about power. And Stevens, with his young arrogance and fresh badge, was too eager to use it. "I told you I don't have it," Pops said, his voice tightening, but he was still trying to stay calm. "I've been living here longer than you've been alive. I'm not some kid trying to skip town or avoid trouble. I live right here." Stevens didn't back down. Instead, he took a step closer, invading Pop's personal space. "That's not good enough. You need to show me your ID or I'm going to have to take you in." The words hit Pops like a slap in the face. Take him in? For what? For walking home? For being an old man with nothing but a grocery bag and a cane in his hand? This wasn't about law and order. This was about control. Stevens wasn't interested in facts. He was interested in asserting his power, in making Pops feel small, like he didn't belong. Pop's grip tightened around his cane. He had been in tight spots before, had faced far worse than some young cop trying to prove himself. But today, something about the officer's condescending attitude made Pop's blood boil. He wasn't about to let this kid treat him like a criminal. "You need to step back, son," Pop said, trying to maintain his composure, though his voice now carried an edge. "You're too close. I'm not resisting, but I'm not gonna stand here and let you make me feel like I'm guilty of something." Stevens didn't move. In fact, he stepped even closer, his boots scraping against the pavement, closing the distance between them. Pops could feel the officer's arrogance radiating from him, could sense that this wasn't just a simple stop anymore. Stevens had made up his mind. He wasn't going to let this go. "I'm detaining you for further questioning," Stevens said, his tone hard, like he had already decided what the outcome would be. "If you've got nothing to hide, you'll comply." The words were an insult. Pops had nothing to hide, nothing at all, but this wasn't about hiding anything. This was about respect, and the officer had none. "You think I'm just going to stand here and let you treat me like this?" Pops asked, his voice rising slightly now, his frustration starting to show. He had been through too much in his life to let some young officer push him around. Stevens didn't answer. Instead, he reached for his radio, calling for backup like Pops was some kind of threat. "Dispatch, I've got a suspicious individual on South Foster. Older black male, possibly loitering. Claims he lives in the area. Need backup." The words sent a chill down Pop's spine. Loitering? He was just walking home. The absurdity of it hit him hard, but he didn't show it. He was too old for this. Too tired to argue, but he wouldn't back down. Not today. Minutes passed, though to Pops it felt like hours. The officer was still standing too close, his hand resting on his belt, just an inch away from his gun. Pops could see the way Stevens was sizing him up, like he was some criminal to be controlled. It wasn't just the badge that made Stevens feel powerful. It was the assumption that anyone who didn't look like him was fair game for harassment. And Pops had had enough. A second squad car pulled up, and two more officers stepped out, their faces just as stiff and unreadable as Stevens was. They didn't look at Pops with understanding. They didn't look at him as a neighbor or a man who had served his country. They looked at him with suspicion, just like Stevens. One of the officers glanced at Pops and then at Stevens. "What's going on here?" he asked, his voice calm, but not sympathetic. Stevens, eager to explain himself, answered quickly. "I'm questioning this man. He doesn't have ID but claims he lives in the area. Need backup to confirm his story." Pops felt his heart sink. Confirm his story, as if the officer didn't believe him. He had lived in this neighborhood for more than 40 years. Everyone knew him. Everyone respected him. But to Stevens, Pops wasn't a respected elder. He was just another suspicious individual. The second officer sighed, clearly frustrated by the delay. "Let's see some ID then," he said, his voice showing impatience. "If you live here, it should be easy enough to verify." Pop's stomach tightened. He didn't have his ID, but this wasn't the point. They didn't need his ID to know who he was. The officer could ask anyone. He could walk a block and ask the neighbors who had known Pops for years. But instead, they wanted to make him prove his worth, to make him jump through hoops for their comfort. And Pops wasn't about to let that happen. "I told you," he said slowly, his voice tinged with frustration. "I don't have it. But I can tell you my address. I've been living here since before you were born. You can check the system. I'm not the one with something to prove here." Stevens just scoffed, rolling his eyes. "Convenient," he muttered, clearly annoyed by the fact that Pops wasn't cooperating in the way he wanted. The seconds felt like minutes as the backup officers began to look at one another. One of them, the second officer, pulled out his radio and began to check Pop's address. Meanwhile, Stevens stayed quiet, trying to hold onto whatever semblance of control he had left. Pops didn't need to say anything else. The officer was losing his grip. The second officer stepped away from the radio, nodding to Stevens. "His address checks out. No warrants. No reason to detain him." Stevens stood there, the color draining from his face as the reality set in. His grip on his radio loosened, his hand slowly moving away from his gun. Pops could see the shift, the realization that he had been wrong. He had tried to make this more than it was, tried to turn it into a battle of power when it had never needed to be. Pops, his chest tight, just stood there, watching as the officer processed what had just happened. He wasn't going to let Stevens see how much it had hurt, how much it always hurt to be treated like this. Instead, he simply bent down, picked up his cane and waited for the officer to make his next move. And then, just as quickly as it had started, the tension was gone. The officers knew they had made a mistake, but they wouldn't apologize. Instead, they just moved on. The second officer turned to Pops. "Apologies for the misunderstanding, sir," he muttered, barely meeting his eyes. Pops didn't say a word. He didn't need to, because he knew this wasn't the last time it would happen. Not in a world where people still assumed his skin made him guilty. He wasn't going to argue. He wasn't going to fight. He simply walked away. The scene was tense, the heat of the afternoon pressing down like a heavy weight. Pop stood his ground, trying to stay calm as Officer Stevens continued to assert his control. The young officer was persistent, pressing for Pop's ID, even though Pops had already explained he didn't have it with him. The moment seemed to stretch on forever, the air thick with unspoken tension. Pops had seen it before, young officers eager to prove themselves, quick to judge, and slow to listen. He knew that his patience had limits, but he was determined not to let this escalate. He had been through too much to let a rookie cop push him around. As the situation began to feel like it was spiraling out of control, the sound of a car engine pulling up broke through the tension. Pops didn't need to turn around. He knew who it was before the door opened. Jackson Carter, his son, stepped out of a sleek black sedan. Jackson was a tall, broad-shouldered man who moved with the calm confidence of someone who had faced far more dangerous situations than this. A former SEAL team commander, Jackson's presence alone commanded attention. The officers didn't know it yet, but the dynamic of this situation had just shifted drastically. Jackson walked toward the scene with purpose. His eyes immediately locked onto Officer Stevens, and the air seemed to thicken even more. Stevens, still standing too close to Pops, glanced over at Jackson and tried to maintain his posture, but the shift in energy was palpable. Jackson wasn't just any bystander. He was someone who knew how to handle pressure, and he wasn't about to let his father be treated like this. Let him go. Jackson's voice was calm but carried the weight of authority. There was no pleading, no question in his words, just a clear demand. Stevens froze for a moment, clearly taken aback by the sudden arrival and the strength of Jackson's words. He quickly recovered, though, his jaw tightening. "This doesn't concern you, sir." His voice had lost some of its earlier confidence, but he was still determined to assert his authority. "I'm handling this." Jackson didn't flinch. He took another step forward, his presence towering over Stevens now. "I don't think you are." Jackson's tone didn't raise, but there was an undeniable force in it that made Stevens step back, even if just for a second. Stevens tried to regain some control, his hand subtly moving closer to his belt, but Jackson's unwavering stance and calm demeanor made it clear that this wasn't going to end the way Stevens wanted. Jackson wasn't like other bystanders who might cower in the face of authority. He had the training, the experience, and the resolve to stand his ground. "I said let him go," Jackson repeated, his voice unyielding. "Now." The words hung in the air like a challenge. Stevens, caught between his pride and the undeniable pressure Jackson exerted, hesitated. He wasn't sure how to react, especially not to someone like Jackson. Stevens had expected this situation to be easy, a quick confrontation where he could flex his power. But Jackson wasn't backing down, and Stevens could feel the weight of that. Stevens took a deep breath and tried to steady himself. "You're interfering with police business. Step back." His voice had a slight edge now, but it lacked the confidence it had earlier. It was clear he was struggling to maintain control. Jackson didn't even flinch. His eyes remained steady on Stevens, and he took another step forward. "I'm not going to step back." His voice was quiet, but the strength behind it was undeniable. "You're making a mistake." The words were simple, but they carried a heavy weight. Stevens hesitated, his fingers twitching near his gun, but something about Jackson's calm demeanor made him second-guess himself. Jackson wasn't threatening, he wasn't raising his voice. He was just standing there, a man with far more power than Stevens realized, and Stevens was starting to understand that. "You don't know who you're dealing with," Stevens said, his voice wavering. "I'm a cop and you need to back off." Jackson tilted his head slightly, his eyes narrowing just a touch. "I know exactly who you are." His voice remained calm, but there was an edge to it now, a quiet authority that made Stevens' knees feel a little weaker. "And I know exactly what you're doing. You're abusing your power." Stevens opened his mouth to respond, but no words came out. He was stuck, caught between his ego and the reality of the situation. For the first time, he wasn't sure how to handle this. "I'm done here," Jackson said, his voice steady. "Let my father go." It wasn't a request anymore. It was an order. The seconds stretched on, and for a brief moment, Stevens remained frozen, his grip tightening on his radio. The officers who had been standing by now exchanged uncertain glances. They didn't know what to do either. Jackson wasn't just some concerned citizen. He was a man who had led operations in places most people couldn't even fathom. And now he was watching them, waiting for them to do the right thing. With a deep breath, Stevens finally let go of his radio and stepped back. "Fine." His voice was tight, but the battle had been lost. "I'm letting him go." Jackson stood there for a moment, watching Stevens as if waiting for him to do it on his own. Then he turned to Pops, who had been standing silently throughout the exchange. Jackson's gaze softened just for a second. "You good, Pops?" he asked. Pops, never one to show much emotion, nodded. "Yeah, I'm good." Jackson's eyes then returned to Stevens, but this time there was no anger in them, just a quiet finality. "You need to think long and hard about how you treat people. My father earned his place here, and you had no right to treat him like that." Stevens didn't respond. He stood there looking defeated, but he didn't say a word. The power had shifted, and there was nothing more he could do. Jackson gave him one last look, then turned to Pops. The two of them began to walk away side by side. Pop's cane tapped gently against the pavement, and Jackson's confident strides matched his father's pace. The air around them seemed to clear, the weight of the confrontation finally lifting. Stevens stood still, watching them go. He knew he had just lost something, though he couldn't quite grasp what. The lesson had been hard, but it had been learned. Sometimes, the most dangerous man in the room wasn't the one with the badge or the gun. It was the one who knew exactly when to speak and when to stay silent. For Pops and Jackson, this was just another chapter in a lifetime of battles. But for Stevens, it was a wake-up call he would never forget. The atmosphere had shifted completely in the span of just a few minutes. Where there had once been tension, now there was an unmistakable feeling of power, but it wasn't coming from Officer Stevens anymore. Pops could feel it, the change in the air. The younger officer, who had been so sure of himself just moments ago, was now beginning to waver under the weight of Jackson's calm authority. Jackson had moved closer to Stevens, his posture unshaken. There was no anger in his eyes, no outward sign of aggression. But there was a firmness there, a quiet strength that made Stevens begin to feel uneasy. Stevens, still standing too close to Pops, was now starting to look like he was the one under the microscope. Jackson's gaze never left him, steady and unwavering, and the longer he stood there, the more Stevens began to realize that this was not going the way he had imagined. Jackson's voice broke the silence, calm but firm, cutting through the tension like a blade. "You need to let my father go." Stevens stiffened at the command. There was no room for negotiation in Jackson's words, no invitation for him to explain himself. It was an order, and one that left no room for doubt. Jackson didn't need to raise his voice. He didn't need to threaten. His presence alone, his quiet confidence, was enough to make Stevens feel like he was a child trying to play in a world far too big for him. Stevens took a step back, but only a small one. He still wasn't willing to admit he was wrong. He couldn't back down just yet, not in front of his fellow officers. "This is an ongoing investigation," he muttered, but there was no conviction in his voice now. It was as if the words had lost their weight. Jackson's expression remained unchanged. "You're making a mistake, son." The words were simple, but there was a power to them that made Stevens feel smaller with every passing second. It was the tone, the calm finality in Jackson's voice, that made Stevens question his own actions. Jackson wasn't threatening him. He wasn't getting angry, but the weight of his words and the quiet confidence behind them left Stevens feeling exposed. He hadn't realized it, but every second Jackson stood there, the more he was unraveling the officer's grip on the situation. "You don't want to do this," Jackson added, his voice dropping just slightly, but with a clarity that could cut through anything. "Trust me, you don't want to go down this road." The words hung in the air like a warning, one that Stevens could feel in his gut. It wasn't a threat. It was a promise, and it was one that made Stevens uncomfortable. There was no malice in Jackson's eyes, just the quiet authority that came from a man who had seen more than his fair share of confrontations, who understood the gravity of every decision. The officer's hands shifted nervously at his sides, and for the first time, Stevens felt the sting of uncertainty creeping in. He hadn't expected this. He hadn't expected to be questioned like this, not by someone who carried himself with such purpose. He had expected a quick resolution, a swift show of authority. But instead, he was left second-guessing himself, his power slipping through his fingers. Jackson took another step forward, closing the gap. "You're about to make a bigger mistake than you realize." Stevens' jaw clenched. His grip on the radio tightened as if it might somehow restore the control he had lost. But Jackson's words kept ringing in his ears, over and over. The weight of them became too much to bear. The situation was slipping out of his hands, and he couldn't hold onto it any longer. For a moment, Stevens just stood there, unsure of what to do next. The other officers, who had been silent observers until now, exchanged glances, but none of them stepped in. They could see what was happening. They knew the power had shifted, and now they were waiting for Stevens to do what he needed to do to resolve the situation. But Stevens was stuck. He couldn't just admit he was wrong. Couldn't just let Pops go, not in front of his colleagues. But Jackson wasn't waiting for him to figure it out. He wasn't giving Stevens a chance to save face. The truth was clear, and it was staring the officer in the face. "You've already made your decision, but you can fix it. Let him go." And just like that, it clicked. The weight of the situation hit Stevens all at once. He had been wrong. He had been too eager to prove something, to assert power, and in doing so, he had alienated not just Pops but himself. He wasn't in control. Jackson was, and Stevens knew deep down that he couldn't keep pretending he was the one with the upper hand. Slowly, reluctantly, Stevens stepped back. "Fine." His voice was barely above a whisper, the words feeling foreign in his mouth. He looked at Pops, then back to Jackson. There was nothing more to say. He had lost. "Thank you, officer." Jackson's voice was still calm, but there was a quiet authority in his words that made Stevens flinch. He didn't answer, only watched as Jackson took a step back, motioning for Pops to follow him. As they walked away, Pops didn't look back. He didn't need to. He had been through worse. He had learned long ago that some battles weren't worth fighting. And today, Jackson had fought for him, had handled it with the calm strength of someone who knew exactly when to speak and when to let silence do the work. Behind them, Stevens stood motionless, his mind racing as the reality of what had just happened began to sink in. He had made a mistake, and now he had to live with it. He didn't have the luxury of pretending it didn't matter. The officers who had watched silently exchanged glances again. They knew the situation wasn't over. An internal investigation would begin soon, and Stevens would have to answer for his actions. But for now, there was nothing more to say. The damage had been done, and the lesson was clear. Jackson had turned the tables with nothing more than his presence, his words, and his unwavering belief in doing what was right. He had made sure that Pops wasn't treated with disrespect, and in doing so, he had ensured that the officer who had once thought himself untouchable now had to face the consequences of his own actions. As they walked away, Pops turned to Jackson. "Thanks, son." Jackson nodded, his expression softening for a moment. "Anytime, Pops." The streets of Baton Rouge seemed quieter as Jackson and Pops walked away from the scene, the weight of the confrontation slowly lifting with every step. The once oppressive heat now felt less stifling, and the sun, which had blazed down just hours earlier, seemed more distant. Pop's cane tapped steadily on the pavement, his gait slower than it used to be, but with a quiet confidence that matched the calm resolve in Jackson's stride. Neither of them spoke for a long while, the silence between them comfortable, unbroken by words. Pops wasn't the type to express gratitude or outward emotion. He had been through too much in life to let a moment like this change him. He didn't need to say anything to Jackson. His son had done exactly what he knew he would, stood up, took charge, and ensured that Pops wasn't just another forgotten man whose rights could be trampled by the system. Jackson, too, remained quiet. It wasn't out of anger or frustration, but because he knew how delicate this moment was. There was no need for words. The job had been done. His father was safe, and that was enough. The entire situation had played out in a way that proved one simple truth. There was still a fight to be fought, but it wasn't always about loud confrontations or dramatic gestures. Sometimes, the real power was in knowing when to stay silent and let your actions speak for you. Behind them, the officers remained standing, watching Pops and Jackson walk away. Officer Stevens, once the one holding all the cards, was now left to deal with the consequences of his actions. He had been forced to release Pops. his authority stripped away by the presence and strength of a man who had fought far greater battles than a rookie cop could imagine. But that wasn't the end of Stephen's story. Far from it. Within hours of the incident, an internal investigation into Stephen's behavior was already underway. His actions, his unnecessary detainment of Pops, his abuse of power, and his disregard for the rights of an elder in his community were being scrutinized. It didn't matter that he was a young officer just starting out. The rules were clear: abuse of power would not be tolerated, and Stevens had made the mistake of crossing that line. As the investigation unfolded, Stevens would be placed on suspension, his career hanging in the balance. He would have to answer for his actions, for the unjust treatment of an innocent man, and for the reckless use of his badge. But none of that mattered right now. What mattered was that Pops had been treated with respect in the end. That was the victory in this moment. Jackson and Pops reached the corner where the police cars had once been, the officers now nothing but figures in the background of a day they would soon forget. Pops glanced at Jackson, his eyes narrowing slightly as he noticed the quiet expression on his son's face. "You did good, son," Pops said finally, his voice low but filled with sincerity. Jackson gave a small nod, his gaze fixed ahead. "Just doing what's right." The simplicity of Jackson's words was all that was needed. Pops didn't need an explanation. He didn't need any grand displays of emotion. Jackson's actions spoke for him, as they always had. As they continued walking down the street, the distant sounds of the city now seemed quieter, as though the world had paused just for a moment to let them breathe. For the first time that afternoon, Pops felt a sense of calm that hadn't been there before. It wasn't just the relief of the situation being over. It was the realization that, for once, he didn't have to worry about being treated like an outsider in his own community. His rights had been upheld and his dignity respected, and that was something worth walking away with. The story of that day would spread, of course. People would talk about how an officer had stepped over the line and how Jackson Carter had made sure that the right thing was done. But it wouldn't just be the story of an officer who had abused his power. It would also be the story of a father and son who had stood together against an injustice. And it would be remembered as a lesson, not just for the officers involved, but for anyone who had ever thought that power could be used to belittle or diminish someone else. The message was clear: respect is not optional, but a fundamental right. Respect isn't something that can be asked for or demanded without cause. It is something that should be given freely, earned through the acknowledgement of another's humanity and dignity. That lesson, simple as it was, carried with it the weight of generations. It was a message Pops had known all his life, but now it was one that Jackson had proven with quiet confidence and strength. And that, perhaps, was the greatest lesson of all, that sometimes the most significant battles are not the ones fought with fists or loud words. Sometimes the greatest victories come through patience, wisdom, and knowing when to stand your ground without raising your voice. As father and son continued to walk in silence, it wasn't lost on either of them that some battles were fought in the quiet, in the spaces between words. They didn't need to speak now. They didn't need to say anything more, because the message had already been made clear. And for once, they could walk freely, without the fear of being followed, watched, or judged. The outcome was more than just the suspension of a rookie cop. It was a reminder that justice, in its truest form, is rooted in respect, and that it's something that should be fought for in silence, with strategy and understanding, until it is no longer just an ideal, but a reality.